to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss how much would an ideal society pay for healthcare? Tim.
In this episode, I'd like to discuss what are the limits of what one wants to pay for healthcare, whether individually or on a more higher collective level. So when I buy a coat, tires, or walk into a restaurant and buy something, one of the central things, if not the central thing under discussion, is how much does the thing cost and what its relative value is or isn't. So I'd buy a steak more often than chicken. Because I'd buy the chicken more often than the steak because the chicken is cheaper. Now, again, I probably like steak better than chicken, but I'd probably buy it more if it was less. Now I don't think it's conspiracy why steak costs a lot of money. Cows are sort of harder animals to do. I think the dollar per calorie rate is higher. I think beans are some of the least the dollar per calorie and so forth. But that's not really the point. I don't think it's a conspiracy there to keep the price of one higher than the other. It's a sort of rational price there. And actually, there's an interesting homeschooling video that said, one way to save money is to eat cheap, don't eat as much meat, or don't eat as much steak. So I do think there's scarcity. Same way with coats. You get the value per dollar coat, or same with tires. And the thing is, I can't really do this with healthcare. It seems like it's only Cadillacs or BMWs, to use a kind of analogy here. Even state socialized healthcare, in theory, everyone gets the same high quality care. Now, of course, in the sort of private system, which no one really has, you sort of could buy things. Now, I would argue that certain political movements, both from the left and the right, sort of don't allow anyone to economize here. And I think this choice, of whether to economize or whether not to economize is essential here. So I could boil my argument or my point into 3 points, 3 subpoints here. So first of all, it's basically a choice between, do you want to have a nice dinner or do you want to pay for an extra surgery here? If you want to a one sentence version, vacation or surgery, nice dinner or knee replacement surgery, So my first point here, opportunity costs exist. Money resources spent, everyone knows this. Money resources spent on drones in Yemen can't be spent on chiropractors, knee replacements, and beach vacations. Even Ben Burgess agrees with this. In his interview with Joe Rogan, they made this point that all this money that goes to military industrial complex can't be spent on healthcare. So apparent, opportunity cost and sort of relative loss of value is not some thing that only right libertarians think about. Also, point number 2, scarcity exists. It isn't infinite everything. Evolution in the Garden of Eden, both of the 2 primary worldviews in the West, which is mainly area of discussion, if not the world, because Jews and Muslims more or less buy in the same sort of fallen worldview. So you can make argument. Evolution will have basically roughly the same out insofar there's scarcity for some reason, whether it's natural because we live on this planet that orbits the sun, that's a giant nuclear weapon or something like the sun, heat death the universe. There's only so many things out there. So even if you take the sort of Hoppian and Chomskyite quote unquote utopians, you're still going to have I know the Chomskyites and the Hoppians will always make points. Well, you abolish this or that, you're going to have less regulation or less more innovation or something like that. Now, different left and right libertarians do slightly different maneuvers here. But in general, I would say healthcare is an expensive good. It's a good that costs time. And even if this is my and also much of the solutions that these guys pose, both Hoppe and Chomsky here, may increase costs elsewhere. So let's say you abolish IP and, let's say regulations or something like that. Well, you might have higher labor costs, and the higher labor costs may cancel out the effect. So it depends how far you want to take the hypothetical here. And my third point here is healthcare demand, if prices are low or super abundance exists. So let's say we have this sort of breakthrough innovation. If you have the breakthrough super innovation and you now have super abundance, the demand for it's also going to go up. I think this is just sort of simple economics here. I would like to go to a chiropractor yesterday, but I didn't go, partly because I wouldn't be able to get an appointment quick enough, and partly because it cost me $80 to do it. It's just not worth it. If it cost $0, I'd be more likely to go to a chiropractor yesterday when my neck was sore. But one of the points I made on our very first episode, speaking of superabundance and scarcity, is Back in the dark ages when the lockdown was starting, one of the arguments was that there wasn't enough ventilators for everybody. Now, regardless of whether this point is actually relevant, whether the ventilators actually do anything, there's another article that came out the opposite say. Ventilators cost like $10,000 to $20,000 to make. Again, you can say, well, under Chomskyite or Hoppa-stan, you might say that costs $2,000. So but that's still $2,000 that can't be spent on a nice dinner. That's $2,000 that still can't be spent somewhere else. So yeah, you could in theory imagine a society that has a ventilator and ICU waiting for every person. Take EpiPens or things like that. They used to be very expensive. Now they're less expensive. Now again, there's always subsidies and there's always IP, and then the Chomskyites would always, funnily enough, would talk about innovation. An interview with Peter J. Chomsky said that, there wouldn't be any dirty jobs because we just innovate robots to get rid of them. Now, whether that's true or not, that's a good question. But, I do think there's scarcity exists. And even under superabundance, you have to make a choice. Like you could either going to spend money on your space program. Let's say you have like a Hutterite commune here where everyone makes the same amount of money. Okay. Hutterites are sort of a Christian subgroup, sort of like the Anabaptists. Everyone makes the same money. Everyone's equally motivated to work. Okay. What level is this community going to spend? Let's say they have a space program and they have, a cancer ward. You can't do both. You can do X, you can do Y, you can try to do X, Y, but if you try, but oftentimes you cannot put all the hours, all the community labor hours into X, Y. If you put them all into X, you put 90% into X. Let's say X is the space program and Y is the healthcare. What is actually the breakdown here? And I think that to me is like the interesting question that doesn't really get answered, because you hear a lot of people talk about that you have a right to healthcare on the left. And, the Christian right, like Peter Hitchens and Steve Bannon and others, basically agree with the Christian left and say that this is something that the state should provide. And also, if you get into like the life, the life debate, so to speak, right to life debate, this also shows up as well. And again, one of the criticisms I have, I think both Sean Gabb and Ben Burgess would be that. In 1960, hospitals, for better or worse, weren't as well equipped with advanced goods. Now, again, I'm well aware that there's a sort of alt medicine out there that suggests that all this expensive good is not that good. But let's just take the argument to suggest that this expensive technology in there, even if you make it cheaper, you still can't. Even if you make the goods cheaper, you still have to make a choice at some point. What's the cost of diminishing return of this extra procedure? And I actually think there's a sort of humane element too. And almost everyone's probably aware of grandparents or aunts or uncles who are elderly. And, oftentimes when they're younger, they say they don't want to have these extensive end-of-life treatments that are quite expensive. Now, again, they might not be as much under an ideal circumstances, but still they would cost something. And in this sort of hypothetical community, that is dollars that can't be spent elsewhere. And even and further, my final point is with respect to insurance here. And I think Hoppe makes this point very well, that insurance is kind of a trick, what a lot of people use. For one thing, it changes your behavior. That's an a priori argument. It just sort of changes behavior. And charity that the Amish do to pay for their bills in the United States, they supposedly won't pay for fun accidents like ATVs, skydiving. So if you get hurt using the ATV, they wouldn't pay $1 million health bill. And even let's say it's $100,000. That's still a significant amount of money that could go elsewhere. Let's say the Barnes Society, or let's say, if you're a rich guy in this community, well, it wouldn't be rich, but you wouldn't have any individuals rich. But I think the point of what is the limits here? And this comes up with Ben Burgess again with his Robinson Crusoe. He gets sort of annoyed because you can make the example Robinson Crusoe has to fish. If Robinson Crusoe is fishing, he can't give medical care to his friend Friday. So there is sort of a scarcity that exists here if you just imagine a two-person society here. So with it, overall, what would you make of my sort of opening question here and comments here? I think at some point this, you always get in the hypothetical game. How far do you want to take the hypothetical here? But I think it's perfectly humane to say, I'm 90. I don't want, if I could have that kind of option, I might not do that. I might say, I don't care about, my health after 90. I'm going to pay less now instead of, pay less now in premiums. If you say, any of those things that happen there, I don't care about. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. If anything, it might be actually a good thing to do, let alone being bad. What do you make about this, Swithin? What do you make about my comments? How much would an ideal society pay? Would it pay almost all of its money after it has food? I think that would be insane. What do you make of it?
Interesting. I think I broadly agree, although I will do the thing that you think Chomsky and Hopper do first, which is annoying. But then I'll get to the question. The more fundamental question, I think, which is basically when is having medical intervention worth it, and how much should you pay for it? So I do think it the case that in a genuine free market of medical care, that the medical bills would be a lot lower. As you mentioned, intellectual property, obviously drugs would be a lot cheaper. Equipment in hospitals would be a lot cheaper. Also remember as well here, if we're going for a completely deregulated one, we're no longer going to have licensing, at least not government licensing, of physicians and surgeons. Now, does this mean that people are going to have a really difficult surgery by someone who isn't really trained? Well, probably not. But lots of other bills would be smaller. I mean, so for instance, if I remember correctly, in certain states in America, dental hygienists can't set up their own practice to do basic dental work. They can only work under an officially registered dentist. And there's lots of sort of licensing things like that, which essentially just push up the cost of lots of different and relatively simple medical procedures. So I do think sort of the wages, as it were, would be lower as well in general. So I do think that'd be a lot cheaper. Now, that said, even under the current American system, you can still get the healthcare significantly cheaper than is generally supposed. Two places that do this. One is cost sharing organizations. So this was basically like a mutual aid society used, because she had a very, very, very rare form of cancer, and they basically paid all the money, and it run to over $1 million or something like that. It seriously rare, seriously aggressive, and the cost sharing ministry, they call it, I think she pays a couple $100 a month, and it hasn't gone up since she had the cancer. So it's not like an insurance company, because typically then it'd be, insurance premiums gone up because you're going to get cancer again, it'd be really expensive. So they're always going down. And there's also things like Crowd Health. This is featured on the Tom Wood Show, where there you can get, average monthly payment for medical bills. Join the scheme is like $175 a month, anyone between the age of 6 and 54. Although you do have basically a $500 deductible for that, or an excess if you're in England. Again, so that is much cheaper than is typically quoted. So even in the currency, you can get relatively cheaper. Now, that said, then the question arises, well, how much would an ideal society pay for it? Because, you could always spend more and you could always spend less. And the question is, by how much? One thing to caveat with this, and I think this is a related question, is I think the reason why society at the moment is paying proportionally more of its income of the sort of output of the economy in medical bills is because you have an aging society, because the birth rate is low. So that's one thing to consider here. Is, well, one of the reasons why the medical bills are going up, basically the older you become, the more expensive you are. So I mean, just taking these numbers from Crowd Health, joincrowdhealth.com, 0 to 5-year-olds are $225 a month, and 55 to 65 is $325. I'm not sure how much they cost for over 65. They maybe don't actually cover them, which would be interesting. I haven't checked. I don't know, but I know that those sorts of things do exist. With the cost sharing thing, I'm pretty sure they do. But it is in general the case that the older you are, the more expensive it's going to be beyond, say, 65 in many cases. So the question is, well, how much should you spend? I think to a large extent, this then gets to sort of like a fundamental sort of philosophical one, which is when is medical intervention desirable? How much value are you going to get from it? And as you mentioned before, it just seems to be the case that there are a lot of people who have medical interventions which basically just keep them alive, and that's pretty much all they do. And the question is, well, is it really worthwhile paying for them? Now, I'm of the view that, well, probably not. But the problem with making these sort of decisions is you're where you are now. You're not where you are in like 30, 40 years time. And, it's a new drug. You don't know how well it will work. It could work really well, so that would be worth spending on. But I think, interestingly, the idea that you want to could have a life extension for as long as possible is probably as a result of the fact that people think, well, when you're dead, and so we've got to live our best life now, and so just a life extension itself becomes an end in itself. I think that's probably one of the moves from society to go that way. When it comes to medical things, when it comes to fun stuff that the Amish won't pay for, I think that's probably worth paying for. I mean, it depends on the particular arrangement. I mean, I mentioned these sort of what effectively mutual aid society. I have no objection to insurance in principle, but I mean, I had the idea that you want to be able to do as much as you can, live life to the max, in a terrible cliche sort of term. And so it kind of would make sense that you would be able to you would want, well, put it this way, if I was someone who did skydiving and I got injured, I kind of want to be treated. And so I'd be kind of willing to pay for that. Depending, of course, what the chances of recovery are like. But the thing is, though, even if I was paralyzed and I could still have my mind and not be in constant pain, then maybe. But you are right. It would depend on the specific costs at the time. And it's interesting you mentioned you didn't go to the chiropractor because it would cost $80. This is where I think a lot of paying out of pocket for particular procedures makes sense. Ron Paul mentions this, that medical insurance in the US was originally started out as a cover for catastrophic injury, which would require a significant amount of money. Whereas now it's kind of covered everything, which kind of doesn't really make much sense. I mean, related to that, I mean, insurance, like car insurance, it's like, you could claim on it, but then it's like, you may as well pay out of pocket because it'll just make your insurance premium go up and you just end up paying more anyway. But in medical fields, it seems like everything is now covered in, at least in America to some extent with that. And same in the UK. I mean, you have loads of people going to, say, the NHS who don't need to go. But because it doesn't cost them anything, well, they go. So you get over usage. So as to how much an ideal society would use of medical care, I would hope they wouldn't spend as much on pure life extension. But that's not obvious. I don't know if they would. Because the more money you have, the more money there is to spend on it. But then again, there's always the opportunity cost. So as society gets richer overall, you might expect proportionally more to spend on it beyond a certain level. But if the ideal society had the idea that life extension per se wasn't desirable, then they probably wouldn't. But again, that's going to depend on more basic kind of theological views of life after death, etc. So those would be my sort of long, rambling thoughts on your original comments.
Your comments about insurance being weird insofar as like it started out for just being, against catastrophic things and move into a thing for like everyday things is entirely correct. Insurance is a weird good. Well, I would argue that healthcare in particular is a weird good. So comments like Hayek, Kenneth Arrow, sometimes you get thrown in the libertarian camp, and as well, of course, the Paul Krugmans, and of course, you can go further left. Your Woodward Wolfers would argue that that healthcare cannot provide, but it's a kind of market failure. You can't. So I would say that healthcare is a weird good insofar as there's a sort of, for really catastrophic things, it's it's a good which for common sense morality people to deal with. It poses problems here. So, like for example, I know someone who was life flighted out of a state park, and I think I'm not exactly sure what they got into an accident in the state park here. I think it was the bill was for the life flight was a long life flight because it's pretty remote, and you know you know if the ambulance could have driven there, like, how many dollars would that have saved? Would that be worth it here? So if you get in these sort of catastrophic situations, you're not really able to make decisions in truly catastrophic situations. And one of the sort of bugaboos with the American system is they'll treat you, but then they'll give you a bill later. And this is how people go bankrupt here. So like even with the cost, those programs you talk about, you have to have the intelligence or the imposition to do it ahead of time. To do it ahead of time. So, and they are still charities. They're charities in the sense that, for two reasons. Number one, they're not for profit. So like Hoppe makes the point that like if you could charge, if health insurance companies are be allowed to actually discriminate, healthy people would get lower premiums, unhealthy people would get higher premiums. There would be an incentive to stay healthy, of course. And this is more or less an a priori argument. It's hard to test this argument. It's hard to test things in general here, but it changes your behavior. And second of all, healthcare insurance is as Hoppe points out, your response about Ron Paul as well is true. Is that health? I'll let it lose my train of thought. Health insurance gives you the premium payout for weird events like that is really hard to do. So you should have to come up with how much will you be willing to pay to have a marginal improvement in your life. So sometimes I think, not that I'm a supporter of the NHS or these single payer systems, sometimes, or even the Soviet system for that matter, because Jeff Dice a while did this is speaking of weird healthcare stories here. Jeff Dice did an interview with a Soviet immigrant, and she said she never got Novocaine. To bring up another story is, I had a cavity filled when I was like in college, and I had to more or less pay for it. So I didn't get Novocaine because I saved like, I don't know, $90. And actually not using Novocaine, it hurts a little bit up front, but it doesn't hurt. You don't have the numbness feeling afterwards. So now, all the people on the government and mega corporation benefit programs would, of course, get Novocaine because, why not get Novocaine? It's what the standard procedure is. So in a certain way, again, you don't really have a choice. Like if you get injured and your friend calls 911 correctly, arguably, and the helicopter shows up and you're out mountain biking in the woods, and then you get presented a bill a month later, it poses a problem here. I don't really know what to do with it. I'm not saying I should become a socialist for this reason, but I do think it's a tension here. And I do think it's one of those issues where healthcare becomes an issue which eats the whole economy. We sort of saw that with COVID. And actually, funny enough, Michel Foucault was one of the first people to identify this, birth of a clinic. He points out that the union between the state and the doctors/hospitals. Because before, doctors were like these people that you called to come to your house. But then there's a pandemic in south of France, and this is where the state got involved, and for like national security reasons. It wasn't that framework then. But healthcare is one of those things where Hayek will make a list of exceptions, but you could drive. I think we said in the Ed Feser episode, you could drive a truck through these sort of exception holes. So I do think it's one of those goods that poses a problem. Unlike you go to a restaurant, you have the choice between the chicken and steak fajitas. No one really thinks it's a crime that you can't purchase a crime. No one thinks it's a moral abomination that you can't purchase the steak fajitas or you can't purchase front row tickets to the Super Bowl. No one really thinks that. Maybe there are some consumerist socialists that might say that, but very few. But with the healthcare thing, this is a much more murkier issue. Now, this is where I think the selfishness factor of some sort of objectivists like Ayn Rand actually end up posing a benefit here. So what do you make of that comment, Swithin? I entirely agree with you that healthcare insurance started out basically just to cover catastrophic things, which is what those charities do, and then transition to everything. And I think that's entirely absurd. I think that's entirely, but there's also this sort of imposition that we have had a growth of procedures. And again, I'm well aware that probably people go to the doctors too much, but in catastrophic things, I think, I'm not a postmodern totally when it comes to medicine. I think there's plenty of things that doctors probably do quite, maybe not, but I think it's reasonable to think that people would die if they didn't have, someone who breaks their back. There's certain things that are reasonable. And these are the limits here. What do you make of this? What do you make of my comments here? It's not really a direct question here, but what do you make of it? It is a weird good, and it is a tension for capitalists or market people to defend. Even Kevin Carson, I think it's a sort of tension. Kevin Carson, sorry to keep interrupting, but Kevin Carson might just say, well, we should just have Medicare or something like that. I mean, maybe. I'm not entirely sure about that. What do you make of this?
So just to clarify, your argument is, given the fact we have such a weird system and you can bankrupt people, would it not be better to have like a basically state socialized system? Is that your sort of, well, it's not a question, but you're sort of holding out the possibility if the choice is between the current system and sort of like a socialized system, a more socialized system, more precisely?
Well, for the American system, I'd say the American system has the best and the worst of both worlds, insofar as, like, I do think I've been, like, if you walk around like Taiwan or even like France, I would say that France, now whether the statistics bear this out is a good question. I would say, for one thing, that Europeans and Taiwanese are healthier on average. Now, whether that's because, like, some of the hatred towards centralized healthcare systems is just because they're the ones tasked with rationing it. Because I think at some level things have to be either like the market. One of the functions of price, according to Hayek, I think, is rationing. I think Mises would agree with that. So we have this weird system here, at least in the United States. But I think the same tension would exist elsewhere. I think the same tension would exist elsewhere. And, the sort of more minarchist economists can sort of be pushed on this. Like Michael Munger was in a debate with a left-winger. I sort of like Michael Munger, but he basically thinks that single payer is more rational, which I thought was, he's been on Russ Roberts a lot. I don't think they're all like, I find that interesting here that like Michael Munger, again, he's not a Rothbardian libertarian, but he's not a capitalist hater either. What do you make of that, Swithin? Like, you are aware that there are plenty of capitalists who are otherwise defender of capitalism who think, no, this good needs to be provided by the state. And same way with national defense as well.
Yeah, there are, and I think that largely comes down to what sees as the increased costs of healthcare over the last 30, 40 years, and that is due to advancements in technology. There's a lot more interventions available to you now than there were historically. So that's certainly true. I'd be interested. That said, though, I do think, now I don't know this for sure, but those people who think that in principle, in the best possible scenario, that the government would need to provide healthcare, which Michael Munger might, whereas by definition, sort of Kevin Carson wouldn't. I do think that there's probably a question here with respect to, in general, sort of healthcare regulation and intellectual property law. If you're somebody who doesn't think ultimately that the healthcare system needs central state regulation and that intellectual property was illegitimate, I severely doubt anybody who held both of those positions would say that the state would require true healthcare, even if they would just take those two positions purely on pragmatic and not sort of moral grounds. But no, it just happened to be inefficient. So, for example, David Friedman sort of flip-flopped on this a little bit, but David Friedman would say that you wouldn't need central regulation of healthcare, and he's sort of against intellectual property, I think, on a pragmatic basis. Now, obviously, he's an anarchist, but all I'm saying is, in principle, you could have somebody who wasn't and hold the same two positions David Friedman does on pragmatic basis on AP and doctor licensing and regulation and stuff. And I think it would be unlikely that person would also hold the position that the state needed to provide healthcare. I think that would be highly unlikely. Now, I do think the American system in particular, as much as I can understand it, because it is a labyrinthine, an astonishingly sort of complex system, is very expensive. That said, it does produce some of the best sort of outcomes from medical intervention than pretty much any in the world. Now, I do think it's true that the Americans on average are not as healthy, say, as the Taiwanese or the French, but that's predominantly probably due to dietary reasons and exercise. You then get an interesting question related to that, which is a lot of people would cite is like the American subsidization of like wheat and corn. And so basic carbohydrates are significantly cheaper than they otherwise would be, which then means people consume more of them. And so they don't eat as much sort of non-carb or processed carbs, and maybe they eat more meat or maybe other sort of protein stuff, and so then would be healthier. Then, of course, is the argument as well, the Americans don't walk anywhere because they drive everywhere, and that's because of, the road system, which was built predominantly for national defense purposes. At least that's the official explanation, I think, with Eisenhower in the 50s. So you have additional sort of health factors at play when you comparing. So that said, though, you could still say that, well, the American system is still as good, but actually, even given the current situation, it'd be better if it was kind of like a single payer or state provided one. I still think evidence from things like Crowdfund Health, cost sharing ministries, and there's also other hospitals I'm aware of, I can't remember what they're called, that basically put all their prices online and you should go to it and get treatment. Price transparency, to my understanding, basically does not exist in the American system. But there are these sort of pockets of relatively less regulated and outside the sort of cartel of the insurance companies and the hospitals, which because the hospitals and the insurance companies like playing a game where the hospitals keep increasing their prices and then they negotiate it.
And the state, it's more of a triangle because you have the state regulator.
Oh yeah.
And this is where, sorry to interrupt you, but this is where Kevin Carson's backhand comment about the FDA is entirely like prophetic. Because like in a way they write the regulations and the state, it's sort of like a love triangle, and all three actors always benefit in a sense here, and the consumers keep losing here. That's be my analysis here.
Oh yeah, entirely. But I think there is evidence, at least so far, that at least at present, there are alternatives you can get outside the insurance system, which can produce significantly cheaper prices than is currently available. Now, you could even, I suppose you could then though say, well, even if you did do that, it would still be too expensive now, possibly. But there does seem to be avenues outside the mainstream system which make it relatively more affordable, such that even if you were going on the basis just of cost, the full sort of state socialized system, you wouldn't necessarily need to go there. Now, eventually, you could say, well, we're kind of having to. Although, interestingly, in the current American hybrid system, the American federal government spends more per head on medical care than the NHS does in England, which is entirely socialized, which is interesting because on that basis, you could kind of argue that the American system is even more socialized than the British system, despite the fact that, well, we use it for free, inverted commas, or at the point of use.
I would say that, like, for healthy people, funnily enough, I think this quote unquote Soviet British system is arguably better. For upper middle class people who are slightly or unhealthy, the American system, who can get like a government or like a mega corporation benefits package, then the American system is a winner by far. I mean, again, that's the main constituency. The sort of those are the people with the power, and they all have, like, I would say in that regard, Americans have the best, or one of the best health cares, considering their otherwise life factors here. Not to make this a debate about whether things can be tested or not, but I've always, like, from travel and just from looking at statistics, like, Talon was making this point with, like, why are Mediterraneans and Japanese so healthy? Well, they walk up steps all day. Their cities are all walkable. I think Tokyo is basically. So, like, you can walk a lot. Like, Americans, you were saying, don't, and you don't have any bone density. And, like, insulin, again, like, the North Koreans have lower diabetes rates than the United States. Concentration and gulag camp survivors have lower diabetes rates too. So you can sort of will yourself off diabetes. And which goes back to the Hoppian point about insurance here. Like if insulin had a cost that wasn't zero, would people, do some fasting and cut down on the sugars? Probably, or the carbs? Probably. I think that would be good here. But yeah, you're correct that the American system per head. I mean, this is a talking point for defenders of Medicare for all here in the United States. That like the British and Canadian systems are in some ways cheaper. But in that sense, I think they might be cheaper for certain actual like material reasons. Do you think mine? Again, it's hard to know.
Oh yeah. I mean, it seems to be the case that the quality of American healthcare is on average significantly better than the British healthcare. The one thing that the NHS does well in most cases is emergency treatment. Fair play to the NHS, that's what they do well. But if it's anything that you need to kind of isn't a strict emergency, as in you've been in a car crash, they're useless. And you'll be on a waiting list forever. And, they could say to someone at my church, the doctor was like, oh, yeah, you need this sort of operation to cut something out of your stomach or something. I can't remember exactly what the procedure was. And it's like, oh, yeah, because your spleen could basically, I think it was a spleen, could explode at any moment and you would die. But we can't do it for like a year or something. At which point she went, right, let's try and find a private hospital. And interestingly there, she paid cash and they gave them a discount because basically all the private, even in the UK, all the private hospitals expect to be paid by insurance. And the insurance companies pay later. They try to negotiate with them for ages. And so hospitals like dealing with cash buyers. When you go to them, look, here's the money, gives the operation. They go, yeah, okay. And for cash, they give you a significant discount. So the massive markup, as it were, when it comes to insurance companies is the same in England as it is in the US, it would seem.
Oh, to go to defending the undefendable route, to be fair to insurance companies, which I think I'm not, to be fair to state insurance companies, in a way, and as well as the NHS for defending the undefendable, I do think at the end of the day, there has to be a kind of, you said you sort of do the annoying thing that Hoppe and Chomsky do. I do think at the end of the day, there is a limit about, and I think the insurance companies, one of the reasons I think the insurance companies have to charge a lot of money is like take with Obamacare. With Obamacare, you basically have to accept everyone, all right, regardless of their actual pre-existing conditions. This is the rule. Now, whether they can get away with that under the table is a good question. Not entirely sure about that. But like in a sense, an insurance company contract in like a Hoppistan market would be somewhat murky. And I mean, some of the quote unquote humanists might get a kind of annoyed that healthy people don't have to pay as much. Unhealthy people have to pay more. Now, again, you could say, well, this insurance is not really, for those things aren't really a quote unquote contract here. In that sort of, it is a sort of strange good. Whoever has to provide it, and I do think whoever has to do the scarcity, because you could say cost is a scarcity too. That limiter, whoever is going to has to do that is going to be somewhat hated, or not happy here. I mean, Karl Marx, funnily enough, speaking of sort of Freudian interpretations of history here, had a daughter die, from my understanding, because there was a medical procedure which he could not afford, which was available at the time. Now, again, it's like, well, there was probably thousands of other people alive at that point who had the same issue, who also had a medical procedure that they could not afford. So there is always sort of the degree in which, and this is where I think my third point in my opening statement here, even in a super abundant society, that's your point about this would matter on philosophical and sort of theological grounds. I'd sort of like to sort of get in that a little bit here at the end. I mean, what do you think should be the total percentage here, whether individual or societal? Because you can imagine, let's say in Kapistan, you only spend, you in theory could get by on if you just ate home cooked meals bought at bottom bracket prices at a supermarket, you can only spend maybe 3% of your money on food, and let's say 3% of your money on housing. Okay, you live in a tiny apartment. Would you want to spend 94% of that remaining money that you make on healthcare? I don't know. That sounds interesting in theory, but I'm not entirely sure if that should be the case, because you also have the production function too. Well, and another interesting backstory: Jimmy Dore, famous American political commentator, comedian, relatively famous, had $100,000 medical procedure for his back or something, and he was doing stand up to pay for the procedure, which I thought was interesting. I mean, that's one of the reasons supports for medical for all. Funnily enough, in the British system, he might not even be able to get that procedure if it was not a quote unquote emergency. He might be like that guy in your church who just has to sort of wait around. So at least in New York, he could do comedy shows by a wheelchair supposedly, and then pay for it. So there is a sort of production function behind there as well. Like in my sort of hypothetical example, do you think 94% of the money should go there? It's a sort of burly, it's sort of like a macabre question here to ask. How much is a life worth? Tyler Cowen says like $1 million or something like that. I think the movie Fight Club says that, and this is a true thing. This is what that they said, that for they had this, one car maker had a thing, the Pinto or something, had exploding exhaust pipe or something like that. It wasn't worth doing a recall because it wasn't worth it. Now that's an insurance company actuary transaction. There's some people who get jobs doing that. I think it's sort of an interesting question here. But you can imagine like a Hoppe stand. And I think Chomsky's stand would have the same issue here. Would you have life flights for everybody? Would you have a ventilator waiting for anybody? Because that was one of the motives for the lockdown. If you had a ventilator for everyone, then even in the worst case scenario, everyone has an ICU bed waiting for you. If you have superabundance, it could happen. What do you make of that? Interesting hypotheticals with him.
I think one of the first things to ask about medical treatment is what's kind of like the minimal standard of living that you require to make it kind of worthwhile to be alive. I would probably say that I have sort of decent mental function, in that I can talk to people, or at least communicate with them. I mean, in principle, I could be dumb, I could be ill in that respect, but I could probably, well, I suppose, maybe if you buy, I think minimally in general, I might have to think about this more, that you could talk to, you could communicate with other people. And let's suppose you're a quadriplegic, and you could still be fed. You might still be able to do things and sort of like be sort of still distinctly human, insofar as you could still use language now, depending what we mean by language, but to have thought in the abstract sense and have a complete sort of idea and communicate. And if you could do that and you were sort of like to a large degree still had that, I think that'd be like a minimum amount that you go, okay, that's probably worth paying for. If it was the case whereby that you were mostly bedridden, you were in pain, you couldn't really talk to people very much, if at all, or communicate with them easily, when you're at that stage, unless there's significant prospects for recovery to a higher state, I probably then go, well, I'll just take what comes. I won't take it. Just try and make me comfortable. I'm not advocating euthanasia, but make me comfortable, and then I'll see out my final few days or weeks or however long that is. Then when it comes to proportion of income, I suppose you could say, well, if you're younger, you probably want to maintain it, depending if you could have, obviously have all these additional costs as well, and whether or not you could work. I mean, in that case, you probably couldn't. Well, I suppose you might if you could work remotely. So that's a different question. Then it's a question, to what extent are you putting a burden on somebody else to keep you alive? Now, if of course you remember some sort of mutual fund, and everyone agreed that they joined this and they wanted that kind of protection in this case, up until the situation where cognitive ability hits the deck and you're basically just you're mostly asleep most of the time, then they would pay for it. So I think I'm probably the opinion that I think they would pay for more than you think they would, although I think that still both of us be less than it currently is. But I would also say that in a sense you would have the healthcare system as intervention would focus more towards probably serious intervention rather than minor ones, because if you have to pay out of pocket for the minor ones, people might just like tough it out and go, well, I don't actually need these drugs. It's kind of painful if I don't have them, but it's fine. Or if any of the less serious ones, they'll just try and take the cheapest version of it. And so I think you'd have a greater sort of standard deviation of treatment of severity than you do at present. It's kind of more of those medium ones, as it were, you could say, sort of taking up the money. So when it comes to how much is a life worth, I mean, I suppose that depends on how much you're willing or someone else is willing to pay for it. I suppose so. So whether Tyler Cowen was right with $1 million, I have no idea.
Well, one area I think you'd agree with me is, in general, I think elderly care is, again, you could say, well, this I'm just, and actually the formal justification for the lockdowns is this as well, is I would say elderly care is overrated, especially if you ask them. I mean, one of the funny things the news reporters once did was asked elderly people if they supported the lockdown, and some people gave them the wrong answer. They actually said they didn't support them. Like, do you think people should stop going out to dinner to keep you? Like they asked you the crass question. They said, not everyone would think that, but like a lot of elderly people seem not to like it, like not like these sort of care. So like there's a sort of humanitarian, like not a totalitarian humanist and so forth. But I will point out that, like, in the same way that death penalties might be more humane than life in prison, I think in a sense these expensive procedures, and if they had to actually pay for them, and there was a book about Amish healthcare options, which is sort of what, in a sense, the Free Society may or may not do, sort of mutual aid. It turns out like the elderly themselves sort of don't want these procedures precisely. They don't want to burden the charity. They want to give it to the young, which I think is a completely rational. I think that's a completely rational position. Now, again, that might be politically incorrect. It may not be politically incorrect. I don't really care. But that would be roughly my position. That it's just basically every year you should evaluate to a mutual aid society ought to decrease. Would you agree with that? And do you agree also that the elderly care is probably, again, it sounds like quote unquote inhumane, but you do have these procedures at end of life, which basically you have to scratch your head. If anyone had to pay for them, very few people would justify it. Like, and again, if you want to say charity pays for it, would the charity even want to pay for it? So this is sort of like a big version of like the not toughing it out issue here. I think at that point the questions do have to be made, because I do think one of the impetuses to get rid of a free society is for security, and this is healthcare security. It's one of the things people go to. So I do think there certainly has to be some kind of thing for any ideal society. What do you make of that, Swithin?
I do think that so with the lockdowns, it's slightly different with the lockdowns. Because I would treat that in a sense of justification for lockdowns as purely life extension. So those elderly people might have themselves have actually wanted to go and do things, which they were basically legally prohibited from doing so, because it would help them. So I think there's kind of a cost benefit on the individual level, which the lockdowns kind of like just can't account for. But yeah, I agree that when you get to a certain age, do I really need this treatment? Is it going to give me that much benefit? So even I was saying, the minimum sort of quality of life would be I could be able to communicate with people, and I'd be able to think and talk. Well, maybe not talk, but at least communicate. That'd be like baseline minimum. I might still go, well, it might get me that, but frankly, I'm probably not going to live that much longer anyway. And would I rather this money have gone to my children or my grandchildren? Probably. And this is the bizarre thing with a lockdown is, with any functioning society, if you want to perpetuate the society into the future, in a sense, what matters most is the children in the society, because they are what's going to perpetuate the society going forward. And what the lockdowns did is they sacrificed the young at the expense of the old. Sorry, they sacrificed the young for the old. I mean, effectively, that was really the justification for it, which is a somewhat bizarre situation. I mean, it's kind of similar in certain respects. There's an old Doctor Who episode in which one guy kind of keeps himself alive by absorbing the life essence of like children and like young people and like under like 20s or whatever. These young women predominantly. And in a sense, the lockdowns are sort of a vampiric action in that respect. So yeah, but I mean, just with the lockdowns in general, I mean, this is why you want to try and get as far away as you can from state socialized healthcare at all, because if they never had anything to do with it, there couldn't be a system to collapse, which would be their fault. This is taking the most benign interpretation of governmental action over the last 2 years, which I'm not inclined to take. But if you were, you could go, oh, well, they just don't want a healthcare system that's theirs, or they have a lot of hand in to collapse under their watch. Well, if it didn't have such a system because it wasn't under their watch, then it wouldn't matter. But back to the point before, yeah, you're going to get to a situation whereby it's not worth paying for it. If this procedure is going to be £60,000 or whatever, and the charity won't pay for it because they don't think it's worth it, and you go 60,000, is it worth it? No, because I can give this to my grandchildren to get a house and stuff and better for them going forward. Then clearly you're not going to pay for it. The question, the empirical thing is really, I think, when it comes to insurance and or like mutual aid societies, will treatment which can achieve a minimum living standard, as you may individually define it, is that going to be relatively affordable for most people? If yes, then it's not really an issue. If no, then of course you're going to make decisions such as, no, let's not spend the 60 grand, let's give it to the kids. So that'd be my response to that.
I entirely agree with the vampire-like comments, but I would say the vampire system existed. The vampire system existed here in some accounts, anyways, and existed beforehand in a sense too. But yeah, the sort of the Dracula nature of the system, I entirely agree, which is one of the reasons why I somewhat oppose it. If it was the other way around, I might be more sympathetic to the system. But since it's this way around, I'm very unsympathetic to the system, regardlessly, and just sort of like a sort of pragmatic, empirical, ethical basis here, forgetting like any sort of like first principles argument here. But I do think it's a problem that a lot of the so-called radical libertarian economists, like not that Hoppe doesn't think Hayek's radical, but a number of them do think this is a good that the state can provide, or it's going to have problems. So I do think an answer to that question, which is, and one of the purposes of this episode for me was to try to figure out, what would an ideal society pay or not pay, and why or why wouldn't it do it? Because I do think at some level there is a scarcity that has to be hit, and I think a lot of times when people say you have a right to health care, what the better question is, what does that not include? Because you could just argue food is health care, as Walter Block pointed out in his debate with Sam Cedar. You could say, well, all cars need airbags, so no cheap cars, because in a sense, if the government has to pick up the tab for accidents, they should all be wearing seatbelts, and they should all. And again, people use the seatbelt justification for all sorts of things the past 2 years. So I do think it's a question here. I think, if you ask, what's the hard problems? It's national defense, it's healthcare, it's definitely, as Kinsella would say, minarchists think the government's bad, except for the really important things like healthcare, education, defense. those things the government is provide. But things like restaurants and less important theme parks, those things can be provided by the market. So I do think it would be less, but it is interesting here. Like what will be the limits here? Those are my overall comments. I appreciate doing these discussions with it. If you have any other comments here, that would be great. But otherwise, thanks for doing it.
The final one, I mean, in the ideal society, I suppose depending on what it is, you could say that the material standard of living would be higher, and so it wouldn't really be as much of a problem. But especially if the birth rate was relatively high, because I do think one thing's missing in sort of this kind of, well, I mentioned it earlier, is you essentially have an increasingly top-heavy age society who are become dependents and are more expensive to keep alive than children are, on average, and that creates a more societal-wide problem. But when it comes to healthcare in general, no, you don't. I mean, if it's the case, if you can successfully make the case against intellectual property and licensing requirements, there is really no argument as to why the market couldn't provide it well at generally a relatively affordable rate. Those areas in medical care which have been more free and less regulated, like laser eye surgery and stuff, they have come down in price. So we have at least some evidence from the less regulated areas that prices can and could come down if the market were freer.
Oh yes, quick addition. Speaking of unregulated areas, things like alternative medicine are really huge in the United States, I think precisely because the formal system, quote unquote formal system, is expensive. So actually chiropractors and other services that are considered, on the fringes, let alone the people that Joe Rogan sometimes interviews, like alternative treatments, they're like very cheap because, and you could argue they're fraudulent, or, you could. Now, that's sort of a tricky aside there. But, your example about laser eye surgery being cheap, because it's outside the system is entirely the case. So I'm sort of doing this to talk myself out of it, but I also think in that way. So sorry to interrupt there with that little aside there.
No, that's entirely true. And then you get to the big question, which is behind it, as you mentioned earlier. Is the sort of the mechanized, as it were, health system actually good for health, etc.? And that is a whole other topic. But now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, or anyone you might think gets something out of it. And it'd be great if you could subscribe on YouTube and on Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you would like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.